Venezuela used to be a land of big dreams, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. It had more oil than Saudi Arabia, and for much of the 20th century, it seemed like the country was headed for endless prosperity.
The country's residents are paying the price. Once Latin America's wealthiest country, the conflict has plunged Venezuela into deep economic turmoil.
The people of Venezuela, fearful and desperate. Millions have already fled to other nations, including the United States.
Venezuela is mobilizing military forces amid rising tensions with the United States.
But today, millions of Venezuelans live in deep poverty, struggling to find food, medicine, or even basic things like clean water and electricity. Money that once bought a cart full of groceries now barely gets you a single loaf of bread. At the worst point of the crisis, people carried huge sacks of cash just to buy small things, and some stores stopped counting money altogether, weighing it instead because it was faster. The contrast between what Venezuela could have been and what it is now is so stark that it almost feels like a different country. So how did a nation that was once one of the richest in Latin America end up so broken? Let's walk through the story, from its rise to the terrible choices that led to its fall, and all the small glimmers of change happening today. To understand all of this, let's jump way back in time a bit. You see, back in the early 1900s, Venezuela was a different place. It wasn't until the 1920s that oil changed everything. By the 1950s, oil money was pouring in, transforming the country. Cities like Caracas buzzed with new cars, shiny buildings, and a growing middle class that lived better than most people in nearby countries. Back then, Venezuela's wealth per person was among the highest in Latin America, even topping some European nations, with a GDP per person of about $7,400 in 1950 dollars, which is equivalent to just over $99,000 today. Oil wasn't just a product, it was the heart of everything. This oil money built a strong middle class. People had good jobs, and the country felt stable, unlike many of its neighbors. Healthcare got better, schools enrolled more kids, and subsidies made life easier for families who might have struggled otherwise. For years, Venezuela seemed to dodge the poverty and chaos that hit other parts of Latin America. People believed the good times would last forever. Workers poured in from places like Colombia, Portugal, and Italy, and oil towns like Maracaibo became hubs of activity, with ships carrying crude oil across the seas to buyers around the world. Eventually, Venezuela earned the nickname of the Shining Star of Latin America. The big problem was that Venezuela leaned too hard on oil. Almost all of its money came from this one thing, so there was no push to grow other businesses like factories or farms. When oil prices were high, the government had tons of cash to spend. But when the prices dropped, trouble hit fast. In the 1980s, oil prices fell from about $35 a barrel to under $15. And Venezuela faced big debts, rising prices, and angry people. By 1989, inflation hit 84%, and riots broke out in Caracas over the cost of living, with hundreds killed in what became known as the Caracazo. The country was importing most of its food by then, because farms couldn't compete with cheap imports paid for by oil. Relying on one resource set the stage for bigger problems down the road, and it showed how risky it was to bet everything on oil. Despite the wake-up call, even after those tough times, the government didn't change its ways. It kept spending oil money on subsidies, social programs, and public jobs instead of fixing the root issues. When oil prices went back up, things looked fine again, masking the deeper weaknesses. The focus on oil also hurt places like the Orinoco Belt, where indigenous communities saw their lands damaged by drilling and got little in return, with rivers and forests suffering from pollution that affected their way of life. By the late 1990s, people were fed up. The wealth from oil wasn't reaching everyone. The poor struggled while the rich seemed to live in a different world, with inequality so high that the top earners had way more than the bottom, as shown by a Gini coefficient of 0.49 in 1998. Many felt left out of their own country's riches, especially after the pain of the 1980s. That's when Hugo Chavez stepped in, promising to fix the system and give the poor a fair share of the nation's wealth. Chavez wasn't like other leaders. In 1992, he tried to take over the government with a military coup. It failed, and he went to jail, but it made him a hero to many who hated the corrupt system. When he ran for president in 1998, he spoke directly to people's anger, promising to end corruption, fight inequality, and use this oil money to help the poor. His words hit home, and he won with 56% of the vote, starting what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, a movement that changed Venezuela for the better. Once in power, Chavez used oil money to make life better for the poor. He poured billions into programs like health clinics in needy areas, called Barrio Adentro, new schools, and markets selling cheap food. Illiteracy dropped from 9% to nearly zero by 2005, and poverty fell from 50% in 1999 to 27% by 2006. For many, especially women who got better access to jobs and education, life really did improve. Chavez became a hero to them, and high oil prices, like when it hit $147 a barrel in 2008, gave him the cash to keep his promises. He even built houses and gave out subsidies to keep things like gas and electricity affordable. Chavez didn't just lead Venezuela, he tried to reshape its place in the world. He used oil not only to fund his government, but also to win allies. Countries across the Caribbean and Latin America got cheap fuel through deals like Petrocaribe, and in return, many backed him politically. His speeches often attacked the United States and big corporations, and that made him popular with people who felt ignored or pushed around by global powers. He became known as someone who stood up for the poor, even if his methods raised eyebrows. Inside Venezuela, things were changing fast. Chavez wanted full control, and he didn't hide it. He weakened the courts, the legislature, and the central bank, making sure decisions came from the top. One of his biggest moves was taking over the PDVSA, the state oil company. During a strike in 2002 and 2003, he fired thousands of skilled workers and replaced them with loyal supporters. That decision had long-term effects. Oil production dropped from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to just 2.5 million by 2013, and it didn't stop there. It kept going down. For a while, it looked like Chavez's plan was working. Oil prices were high and money kept coming in. Gas was cheaper than bottled water. Food was sold at low prices and subsidies helped many people. But there was a catch. The country started importing almost everything, from food, medicine, down right to clothes, because local businesses couldn't compete with cheap goods paid for by oil money. Farms and factories struggled. Between 2000 and 2010, manufacturing dropped by 20%. Venezuela became more and more dependent on imports, and that made the economy fragile. The warning signs were clear. If oil prices fell, the whole system would be in trouble. Unlike countries like Norway, which saved oil money in a fund now worth over $1 trillion, Venezuela spent everything. There was no backup plan, no cushion to fall on. It was a risky way to run things, and it eventually caught up with them. At this point of the story, you might be thinking that you're having deja vu, but let me be the first to tell you that you are not. Venezuela was just really bad at learning from its own past mistakes. By the early 2010s, the cracks were showing. Local production kept falling, and by 2014, food output had dropped 60% compared to 1998. Then came the crash. Oil prices fell from over $100 a barrel to under $30 by 2016. This was a disaster. Venezuela's main source of money dried up, and the country felt it everywhere. With less cash, the government looked for other ways to make money. One of the government's biggest efforts was to replace oil revenue with the creation of the Arco Minero del Orinoco, a massive mining zone launched in 2016, covering about 12% of the Venezuelan territory, roughly the size of Portugal. Located in the southern part of the country, the area includes parts of the Amazon rainforest and is home to dozens of indigenous communities. The government promised it would be a regulated project to boost the economy, but in reality, it opened the door to lawlessness, environmental destruction, and human rights abuses. Instead of state-run mining with oversight, the area became overrun by criminal groups, informal miners, and armed gangs known as sindicatos. These groups used toxic chemicals like mercury to extract gold, which ended up polluting rivers and poisoning water supplies. Mercury exposure caused serious health problems in local communities, including birth defects and neurological damage. Some indigenous leaders who spoke out were silenced or disappeared. The profits often didn't go to the state or the people, but instead to military figures, corrupt officials, and armed groups who used the trade to fund themselves. The Arco Minero wasn't just a failed economic project, it became a symbol of how far state control had collapsed, and how the crisis turned natural wealth into a source of even greater suffering. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro stepped in, promising to carry on his legacy. But Maduro didn't have the same support or presence. Instead of adjusting course, he kept the same approach, printing money, holding onto subsidies, and taking over more businesses. He used the military and force to stay in power, even working with groups like Colombia's ELN guerrillas to keep control. Farms were seized and mismanaged, leading to even lower production. By 2017, Venezuela defaulted on $60 billion in debt, and the economy spiraled into one of the worst cases of hyperinflation ever recorded. In 2018, inflation hit 1.7 million%. Prices doubled in days. A loaf of bread could cost 10 times more in a week. People's savings vanished, and cash became so worthless that people carried bags of it just to buy basic items. New bills were being printed constantly, but they couldn't keep up. The government tried to fix things with price controls and currency rules, but that only made things worse. Stores couldn't afford to sell goods at the set prices, so shelves stayed empty. People waited in long lines for food, medicine, or fuel, often leaving with nothing. Women, who usually handled shopping for their families, bore the brunt of these daily struggles. Meanwhile, PDVSA, the state oil company, was falling apart. Years of corruption and poor management pushed production down to under 400,000 barrels a day by 2019. Oil spills became more frequent, damaging fishing villages and wildlife as toxic water spread through rivers and coastal areas. Corruption was everywhere. Since 1999, around $300 billion have disappeared into secret accounts. Gas, sold for pennies, was smuggled across the border for profits. Gangs and military officials controlled access to food and fuel, making life harder for ordinary people. Violence increased, and more families were forced to flee. Instead of fixing the crisis, Maduro used force. Protesters were met with tear gas and bullets. Opposition leaders were jailed or driven into exile. Independent media was shut down. Venezuela shifted from a fragile democracy to a full dictatorship, closing off any chance for new ideas or solutions. As the government lost control, criminal groups stepped in. Some became more powerful than local officials. Inside prisons, gangs known as PRANs created their own rules and ran businesses behind bars. Over time, their leaders called mega PRANs expanded their reach beyond the prison walls. They ran neighborhoods, charged locals for protection, and decided who could live where. In some cities, they even replaced the police entirely. The real police either worked for them or stayed out of their way. Armed groups smuggled gas, gold, and food, often with the help of soldiers or government insiders. The line between government and criminal power blurred, and regular people were stuck in the middle. Crossing the wrong person, whether a gang member or an official, could cost you everything. And this wasn't just about crime anymore. It was about power shifting into the hands of those who saw the crisis as a way to profit. By the mid-late 2010s, the economy wasn't just in trouble, it was falling apart. Hyperinflation destroyed the value of money. Shortages emptied stores. Hope faded. Venezuela, once the richest country in Latin America, became one of the poorest. Between 2013 and 2021, GDP dropped by 80%, worse than many countries at war. But this wasn't just about numbers. It was about a human disaster that tore families and communities apart. Daily life became a struggle. Supermarkets had no food. Pharmacies had no medicine. Hospitals ran out of basics like gloves and clean water. During blackouts, doctors used flashlights to perform surgeries. For most people, survival became the only goal. Children suffered the most. In some areas, 30% were malnourished by 2018. People dug through trash or traded belongings for food. A country that once had plenty was now starving. By 2019, 7.6 million people needed food aid. Add to that the complete collapse of healthcare. Hospitals couldn't treat patients. Malaria cases jumped from 36,000 in 2009 to over 400,000 by 2017. Infant deaths rose by 30% between 2013 and 2016. Pregnant women had little access to care, putting their lives and their babies at risk. Blackouts, broken transport, and no clean water made life feel impossible. Mental health worsened as people felt hopeless and scared. Many turned to faith or community groups just to cope. This level of suffering drove millions to leave. By the late 2010s, people walked across the borders with only a bag. Others headed to Peru, Chile, and the United States or Europe. Families split apart as parents left to find work and send money home, often leaving women and children behind to face the hardships. Now, in 2025, nearly 8 million Venezuelans have left the country. That's almost 1 in 5 people, making it one of the largest migrations in modern history, second only to Syria. Neighboring countries struggled to keep up. Border towns in Colombia were overwhelmed, and refugee camps appeared across South America. Those who left weren't just looking for any job. Many were doctors, engineers, teachers, and students. As wages collapsed, even the best educated had no reason to stay. Professors earned so little that some quit to sell snacks on the street. True story. Top universities lost talent. Labs shut down due to blackouts and a lack of materials. Between 2013 and 2022, more than half of Venezuela's doctors left. Hospitals were left without surgeons, specialists, or even basic care. Schools closed or operated without teachers. In some rural areas, formal education disappeared entirely. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you've ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now's kind of the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to get started and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. And that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So, if you are someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, You can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or the card on your screen. The brain drain didn't just hurt the present, it left a hole in the future. With doctors, teachers, and engineers gone, there were very few people left to train others or rebuild what had been lost. A country that once sent doctors abroad to help others now couldn't keep its own alive. For many young people still in Venezuela, finishing school felt out of reach. In all of this time, in all of this chaos, Maduro has kept power by blaming the United States and others for their problems, calling it economic warfare, and screaming the word sanctions like it's a war cry. Maduro didn't just deny the crisis, he blocked help that could save lives. When the opposition, backed by the US, tried to bring humanitarian aid across the Colombian border in 2019, the government refused to let it in, calling it a cover for foreign interference. Trucks were set on fire, border crossings were closed, and clashes turned deadly. Even neutral organizations like the Red Cross were kept out at first. It wasn't until much later that limited aid was allowed in, but only under strict conditions that kept it depoliticized. The regime feared that accepting large-scale humanitarian aid would be a public admission of failure. Speaking of sanctions, in this blame game over Venezuela's collapse, sanctions always come up, and with good reason. By the late 2010s, Western measures had begun tightening, first targeting corrupt officials before moving on to the country's lifeblood, oil. The effect was immediate and brutal. Venezuela was locked out of global banking systems. This led to export revenue collapsing, and the nation lost wealth equal to more than twice its GDP since 2015. Imports shrank, inflation surged, and the government found itself cornered. For Maduro, sanctions were a direct threat to power. For ordinary citizens, it became a slow suffocation. Critics argued the measures deepened the humanitarian crisis by cutting off food and medicine. On the other hand, supporters insisted they were essential to pressure a regime that had dismantled democracy. Both perspectives hold weight, but the outcome was the same. Venezuela was isolated, broken, and forced to search for new lifelines. Those lifelines came from unlikely partners. Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran stepped in with loans, technical support, and political backing. China alone poured more than $50 billion in oil-backed credit. Russia supplied military equipment and surveillance systems. Iran helped repair refineries that had been left in disrepair. These partnerships kept the regime afloat, but they came at a cost. In exchange for survival, Venezuela ceded autonomy. Surveillance technologies from abroad tightened domestic control, while foreign mining concessions poisoned rivers and displaced indigenous communities. The help was real, but it was never free. Even with these deals, oil production kept falling. From a peak of more than 3 million barrels a day, output plunged below 1 million barrels by the late 2010s. As the oil industry imploded, the national currency followed. The bolivar, once a proud symbol of independence, became a cautionary tale of hyperinflation. It was renamed, redenominated, and rebranded. Bolivar Fuerte, Bolivar Soberano, Digital Bolivar. Each attempt stripped zeros from banknotes in the hopes of restoring trust. None succeeded. Even with some improvement in inflation, it still hovers at around 180%, eroding confidence. People stopped trusting the currency altogether. They saved in dollars, gold, or goods. For everyday trade, soap, rice, and diapers became stand-ins for money, proof that faith in the financial system was gone. Eventually, Maduro gave in to reality. Dollarization became official. Prices were listed in dollars, and even street vendors accepted them. For those with access to US currency, often through remittance from relatives abroad, life became slightly more bearable. By 2023, Venezuelans overseas were sending back over $4 billion annually, creating a crucial safety net. But this new economy brought new divides. A small elite could shop at luxury bodegones, while most still couldn't afford the basics. The elderly, especially those without family abroad, were left behind. Maduro seized on dollarization to stabilize his rule. He reopened casinos, relaxed price controls, and invited foreign investors into luxury hotels. Official statistics even boasted of recovery, with the government claiming 9.3% growth in early 2025. This was later revised to 6%. The IMF, however, warned of a looming 4% contraction. Behind the numbers, daily life told another story. Infrastructure remained broken. Rural areas endured constant blackouts. Water systems failed regularly, and roads crumbled. The minimum wage had been frozen at 130 bolivars since 2022, worth barely $3.50 a month. No statistic could mask that reality. So, where does this leave Venezuela today? In 2025, the country exists in a strange limbo. It's no longer unraveling at the pace of a few years ago, but it isn't really recovering either. Daily life has settled into an uneasy rhythm. US dollars circulate wildly, calming prices and filling shops with more goods than before. Some businesses have reopened, yet wages remain painfully low. Public services are unreliable, and most Venezuelans are still just trying to get by. The crisis hasn't ended. It's really only just changed shape. The government points to oil production inching above 900,000 barrels a day and insists GDP is rising. But these claims clash with the lived reality. Outside major cities, electricity cuts remain routine. Water systems collapse again and again. Hospitals run short of medicine. And schools operate with too few teachers, as many have emigrated. The so-called recovery is patchy. A few pockets of progress surrounded by a sea of stagnation. Politics has only deepened the sense of despair. The July 2024 election was meant to be a turning point. Opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez won decisively, but Maduro refused to step aside. His government declared victory, ignored the results, and imprisoned dozens of opposition leaders. Nearly 2,000 political prisoners remain behind bars. International groups condemned the move, but Maduro held firm. The military stayed loyal, the courts backed him, and the promise of a democratic transition evaporated. For many Venezuelans, the election was not just a disappointment, but confirmation that the ballot box alone could not deliver change. This has left the nation split into two parallel realities. A small, dollar-rich class enjoys imported goods and better services, while the majority scrape by on near-worthless wages or survive on remittances. Migration, once a flood, has slowed. This is not because conditions improved, but because so many have already left, and others can no longer afford the journey. Those who remain improvise, growing food at home, bartering goods, patching together small incomes. These survival strategies helped families endure, but cannot repair a broken national system. Meanwhile, the government shows little interest in genuine solutions. There's been no major investment in solar power. Even in sun-drenched regions like Zulia, roads remain cratered, public transportation is unreachable, and the healthcare system is underfunded. The gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen, eroding social cohesion. Maduro's grip on power remains secure. He controls the military, the judiciary, and the levers of the economy. International pressure has failed to move him, and the 2024 election proved that votes alone cannot unseat him. For many Venezuelans, hope has been replaced by resignation. They've lived through promises of reform, only to see control tighten whenever the regime feels threatened. The future remains uncertain. Some in the oil sector believe new foreign partnerships could revive production if the sanctions are lifted. There's talk of new investments in the Orinoco Belt and refining upgrades, but without political change, investors are cautious. Elections are unlikely to bring a real transition under current conditions. For ordinary people, the focus has shifted from hoping for big change to just trying to survive another day. A rise in oil prices might bring in new revenue, but without reforms, that money will only strengthen the ruling class rather than reach the people. Institutions are weak. Public trust is low, and the damage from years of mismanagement runs deep. Venezuela still has the raw materials. It has people willing to fight for a better future. But without real change at the top, every effort will hit the same wall. Venezuela's story isn't over. It still has oil, it still has people willing to rebuild, and it still has the potential to rise again. But unless there's a real shift in leadership, one that prioritizes the people over power, the same mistakes will keep happening. The real challenge now isn't just fixing the economy, it's rebuilding trust in institutions, in each other, and in the idea that Venezuela can still be a home worth fighting for.